Obviously, we've got concerns in relation to these mushrooms and where they've come from. Is that something you've done in the past, foraging for mushrooms or anything? Never.
This morning, detectives arrested a 49-year-old female.
Oh, look, it's a tragic thing that's happened. If you eat the wrong ones, you get very unwell. I think if you're lucky, you'll just get sick, but if you eat the wrong ones, it can be tragically fatal.
By late afternoon, the plates had been cleared from the table. The pastry had been cut open. The beef had been eaten. The mushroom filling, dark, finely chopped, and almost impossible to separate from the rest, had disappeared with it. There had been 4 invited guests at the house in Leongatha: an elderly couple, the wife's sister, her husband, a local pastor. The host had prepared individual beef Wellingtons. She had served them at her dining table. Afterwards, there was dessert, conversation, the ordinary rituals of a family lunch. Before the weekend was over, all 4 guests would be violently ill. Within days, 3 of them would be dead. The 4th would spend weeks in hospital, surviving an assault on his body so severe that doctors feared his liver would fail completely. The host, Erin Patterson, would tell police that she too had been sick, that the mushrooms must have entered the meal by accident, that she had bought some from a supermarket and others from an Asian grocery store she could no longer identify. But investigators would find a discarded food dehydrator at a rubbish tip. They would recover photographs of wild mushrooms on electronic devices. They would examine phone resets, online sightings, hospital visits, plates, leftovers, and the precise way the meal had been portioned. And almost 2 years later, 12 jurors would decide that the lunch had not been a tragic accident. They found Erin Patterson guilty of 3 murders and 1 attempted murder. This is not simply the story of a poisonous mushroom. It is the story of trust, placed in a relative, across a dining table, and of how one of the most ordinary invitations imaginable became the centre of one of Australia's most extraordinary murder cases. This is Dark Australia. To understand why the lunch appeared so ordinary, we need to begin with the people who accepted the invitation. Don and Gail Patterson lived in Korumburra, in Victoria's South Gippsland region. They were Erin Patterson's former parents-in-law, the parents of her estranged husband, Simon. Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, attended the lunch with her husband Ian. Ian was a pastor at the Korumburra Baptist Church. The 4 guests were connected not only by family, but by faith, community, and decades of shared life in a part of Victoria where reputations are built slowly and relationships overlap. They were not thrill seekers. They were not people stepping knowingly into danger. They were older relatives accepting lunch at the home of a woman they knew, the mother of Don and Gail's grandchildren. That matters, because poisoning often begins long before the toxin enters the body. It begins with access, with familiarity, with the absence of any reason to inspect the plate in front of you. Erin and Simon Patterson had separated, but their lives remained connected through their children. The relationships surrounding that separation were complicated. Evidence at trial revealed periods of warmth, tension, frustration, and conflict, as is often true in families after a marriage breaks down. Yet the prosecution was not required to prove a clean cinematic motive. There was no single document or recorded confession explaining why Erin Patterson wanted these 4 people dead. The case would instead depend on whether the surrounding evidence proved that she had deliberately placed death-cap mushrooms into the meal she served them. Gail Patterson's diary captured the ordinariness of the plan in a few words. Lunch at Erin's with Heather and Ian. A small appointment in an ordinary diary. No warning. No sense that this date would later be examined in a courtroom, projected on screens and discussed around the world. The lunch was held on Saturday, the 29th of July, 2023, at Erin Patterson's home in Leongatha. Simon Patterson had also been invited. He did not attend. The jury heard that he pulled out the previous day. That absence would become one of the case's haunting details. Had he attended, prosecutors alleged, there may have been a fifth poisoned guest. But the jury's task was not to decide what might have happened. It was to decide what Erin intended when she served the 4 people who did arrive. The property itself was relatively new. Patterson told the court she had been involved in its design, beginning with a rough plan drawn in Microsoft Paint before a building designer adapted it. It was a home she knew intimately, including the open-plan kitchen and dining area where the lunch unfolded. At some point before the lunch, Erin told the guests that she had health concerns to discuss. The precise nature of that conversation became contested, but it gave the gathering an emotional purpose beyond a casual meal. They arrived expecting family conversation. They sat down trusting the person who had invited them, and on the table in front of them were individual parcels of beef, pastry, and mushrooms. Before the invitation, the relationship between Erin and the Patterson family had not been uniformly hostile. Gail had supported Erin during motherhood, and the families remained linked through the children. That history is important because it explains why a lunch invitation could still be accepted even after Erin and Simon had separated. Family relationships rarely exist in one emotional state. Affection can sit beside resentment. Help offered years earlier can coexist with arguments in the present. The prosecution did not need to flatten that history into a simple feud. Its case was that, whatever the private emotional path, Patterson eventually made a deliberate decision to kill. The invitation also placed the guests in a familiar social role. Older relatives often arrive wanting to help, mediate, or listen. They do not arrive as investigators. They do not ask to inspect packets, compare plate sizes, or watch how a host assembles each portion. Courtesy requires them to accept what is served. In this case, courtesy became vulnerability. Even Simon's withdrawal from the lunch did not necessarily transform the gathering into something suspicious. Plans change. People cancel. The remaining guests still had a reason to attend and a reason to believe the conversation mattered. The table was therefore set not only with food, but with expectations, that family difficulties might be discussed, that concern might be offered, and that everyone would eventually go home. Beef Wellington is a meal built in layers. A piece of beef is surrounded by mushroom duxelles. Mushrooms cooked down until their moisture has reduced, then wrapped in pastry and baked. Once assembled, the ingredients become difficult to separate. The mushroom is not a garnish sitting visibly on top. It is integrated into the dish. At trial, Erin Patterson described modifying a recipe from Nagi Maihashi's Recipe Tin Eats cookbook. Instead of making one large Wellington, she prepared individual portions. That decision was critical. Individual portions meant each meal could contain a different amount or mixture of mushroom. It also meant the host could distinguish one plate from another. Ian Wilkinson later recalled that the guests were served on large white plates, while Erin ate from a smaller, differently coloured plate. Patterson disputed the suggestion that the plate distinction was so simple, saying different plates were used. But the broader point remained. She prepared the meal, portioned it, plated it, and served it. The children were not present at the table. The 4 guests ate the Wellingtons. Erin said she also ate one. There was no immediate collapse. Death cap poisoning does not usually announce itself with the first bite. There may be no unusual taste strong enough to warn the person eating it. The meal can end. The dishes can be cleared. The guests can leave believing the danger has passed because they do not yet know there was danger at all. The 4 relatives returned home. Then the latency period began. Hours later, the symptoms arrived: vomiting, diarrhea, severe abdominal distress, fluid loss so intense that the body can rapidly become dangerously dehydrated. At first, it can resemble catastrophic food poisoning, a violent but recognizable illness, something the body might expel and recover from. But death cap poisoning has a cruel rhythm. The first phase can ease. The patient may appear to improve. Inside the body, the damage continues. Don and Gail Patterson and Heather and Ian Wilkinson were admitted for medical care. Their shared meal immediately became important. 4 people from one lunch, suffering a similar and unusually severe illness, created a pattern doctors could not ignore. The possibility of poisonous mushrooms emerged, and when it did, the question was no longer simply what they had eaten. It was whether anyone else had eaten it too. There is a particular intimacy in preparing individual meals. A host decides how much filling goes into each parcel, how the pastry is folded, and which plate receives which portion. The prosecution invited the jury to see that control as part of the method. The defense asked them to see nothing more sinister than a home cook adapting a recipe. The courtroom could never recreate the exact atmosphere of the lunch. It could reconstruct seating, dishes, and movements, but not every glance or unfinished sentence. Ian Wilkinson's memory became especially important because the other 3 guests could no longer describe what they saw. His account was tested against photographs of the dining space and the plates found in the home. Patterson said she had eaten from the meal and later suffered diarrhea. The prosecution argued that her conduct was inconsistent with the same exposure that devastated her guests. Yet poison does not affect every person identically, and the case could not rest simply on the fact that she lived. It rested on the allegation that her own portion had been kept separate from those containing a lethal dose. The individual Wellingtons made that possible in a way a shared casserole or single-sliced Wellington would not. The poison could be concentrated within selected parcels. A host could serve 4 contaminated meals and retain a safer one. This was an inference, not a filmed act, but it explained the otherwise striking division between the guests' catastrophic poisoning and Patterson's survival. Erin Patterson told medical staff that she had also become unwell.
Why have you come to hospital? And the response from Erin, I think I've got gastro.
The prosecution did not deny that she reported symptoms. The central question was whether those symptoms showed she had unknowingly consumed the same poison, or whether they formed part of an attempt to appear like another victim. The day after the lunch, she took her son toward Tiab for a flying lesson that was cancelled. CCTV later captured her stopping at a service station and entering a toilet for approximately 9 seconds. At trial, Patterson said she had disposed of tissues after an urgent roadside bowel movement. Prosecutors argued that the stop did not support the severe illness she described. On the Monday morning, Erin attended Leongatha Hospital. Dr. Chris Webster became concerned that she may have been exposed to a potentially lethal amount of death cap toxin.
I quickly took her into the urgent care proper. She sat down on a chair not far from Ian and Heather, and I explained that death cap mushroom poisoning was suspected and where'd you get the mushrooms?
She left against medical advice, saying she needed to care for animals at home and prepare her daughter's ballet bag. When the doctor could not reach her by phone, he made the serious decision to contact police for her welfare. Patterson returned around 90 minutes later. The prosecution argued that during this period, she was not simply attending to domestic responsibilities. They said she was creating a false explanation for the mushrooms, a story that some had been bought from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne. The difficulty was that she could not identify the shop. There was no receipt, no confirmed retailer, no independent trail leading investigators to an accidentally contaminated commercial product. She also said dried mushrooms had been purchased from a supermarket. Commercially sold mushrooms from reputable retailers are considered safe. Death caps are wild mushrooms. Their toxins are not removed by cooking, peeling, or drying. As the surviving diners were transferred to larger hospitals, doctors faced the defining challenge of amatoxin poisoning. By the time the worst internal damage becomes obvious, the toxin may already have moved through the body and disrupted the liver's ability to keep a person alive. Gail Patterson died on the 4th of August 2023. Heather Wilkinson died the same day. Don Patterson died the following day, August 5th. 3 people who had arrived for lunch 1 week earlier were dead. Ian Wilkinson survived after prolonged intensive treatment. His recovery would make him both the only surviving guest and an indispensable witness to the meal. For the families, the speed of the loss was almost impossible to absorb. Illness had become emergency. Emergency had become organ failure. Then within days, funerals had to be contemplated while police were beginning to ask whether the deaths were accidental at all. The host of the lunch was not just a source of information. She was becoming the focus of the investigation.
This is Dr. Chris Webster calling from Leongatha Hospital, and I have a concern regarding a patient that presented here earlier but has left the building and is potentially exposed to a fatal toxin from mushroom poisoning.
For clinicians, the delay between eating and illness can be a clue. Many common forms of food poisoning begin within hours, because preformed toxins irritate the gastrointestinal system quickly. Amatoxin poisoning often waits longer. By the time vomiting begins, the meal may feel distant, and the patient may not immediately connect a mushroom eaten at lunch with symptoms arriving overnight. Treatment can include aggressive fluid replacement, repeated blood tests, medicines intended to reduce toxin uptake or protect the liver, and early consultation with transplant specialists. Decisions have to be made before certainty is complete. A patient may be speaking normally while laboratory results show that the liver is moving towards failure. The liver's decline affects the entire body. When clotting proteins are not produced, bleeding risk rises. When toxins are not cleared, confusion and altered consciousness can follow. When blood sugar cannot be regulated, the brain is threatened. Kidney injury complicates every treatment decision. The body is not simply fighting a stomach illness. Multiple systems are losing the support of an organ essential to survival. This is why the apparent improvement phase is so dangerous. The vomiting may stop, and the patient may believe the worst is over. Families may feel relief. But the quiet can be temporary. In severe cases, the laboratory evidence continues to worsen while the visible symptoms briefly retreat. For Don, Gail, Heather, and Ian, the medical teams were not treating 4 isolated illnesses. They were treating a cluster. The shared meal narrowed the possibilities and made the identification of a mushroom toxin urgent. It also created an evidentiary bridge between the dining table and the intensive care unit. The death cap mushroom, Amanita phallides, is responsible for some of the world's most lethal mushroom poisonings. It can look harmless. Its colouring varies from pale yellow and green to olive brown. It often grows near oak trees. And it contains amatoxins, compounds capable of surviving cooking and drying. A single mushroom may be enough to kill an adult. The danger begins at the cellular level. The liver is the body's chemical processing centre. It filters blood arriving from the digestive tract, transforms nutrients, produces proteins needed for clotting, regulates energy and helps remove substances that would otherwise accumulate to toxic levels. Amatoxins interfere with an enzyme cells need to produce essential proteins. Cells with high metabolic demands are especially vulnerable. The liver, receiving blood from the gut, becomes a major target. The clinical course is often described in phases. First comes the silent period. For 6 hours, 12 hours, sometimes longer, a person may feel normal. That delay is dangerous because the window for early intervention is narrowing while there is no obvious reason to seek help. Then comes the gastrointestinal phase. Relentless vomiting, diarrhea, cramping and dehydration. Electrolytes become disturbed. Blood pressure can fall. The kidneys are placed under strain. Then sometimes, the symptoms appear to improve. This is not necessarily recovery. It can be the deceptive interval before liver injury becomes unmistakable. As liver cells fail, enzymes rise. Blood clotting deteriorates. Glucose regulation can become unstable. Waste products build. The brain can be affected. Kidney failure may develop alongside the liver failure. In the most severe cases, the only remaining chance may be an urgent liver transplant if the patient is medically suitable, if an organ becomes available, and if the decline can be survived long enough for surgery. For the 4 lunch guests, the poisoning did not remain an abstract toxicology lesson. It unfolded inside real bodies, across emergency departments, ambulances, intensive care units, and conversations with families who had expected a weekend lunch, not a medical catastrophe. Ian Wilkinson survived. His survival did not make his experience less severe. It meant enduring it long enough to tell the court what happened at the table. The medical evidence also gave investigators something powerful: confirmation that the pattern was consistent with death cap mushroom poisoning. And later, forensic testing detected beta-amanitin in remnants associated with the meal. Those remnants had almost been lost. 2 days after the lunch, Patterson directed police to leftovers in a bin. Investigators recovered pieces of pastry and mushroom material. Experts could not identify death cap fragments simply by looking at them, but chemical analysis detected a toxin associated with death cap mushrooms. The meal itself was speaking through what remained of it. The medical story established how the victims died. It did not, by itself, establish how the poison entered the food. For that, police began looking backward, into Erin Patterson's kitchen, devices, purchases, and movements. Investigators often distinguish between a lie about something peripheral and a lie that touches the center of the alleged crime. Forgetting a time or misremembering a conversation may be human error.
Obviously, we've got concerns in relation to the mushrooms and where they've come from. Is that something you've done in the past, foraging for mushrooms or anything like that? Never.
No.
Right. Do you preserve foods or anything like that?
No.
Have you ever dehydrated food or anything like that?
Patterson's explanation was that fear took control. Simon had accused her. Media attention was intensifying. She believed ordinary mushroom activity would be interpreted in the worst possible way. From that perspective, throwing away the dehydrator and deleting material were disastrous attempts at self-protection, rather than evidence of a murder plan. The prosecution's response was that innocent panic did not explain the full pattern. It did not explain the false retail mushroom story, the remote phone reset, the apparent effort to dispose of the dehydrator before police could examine it, or the inconsistencies about leftovers and the children. The phone reset from a distance was especially striking. The device was no longer in her hand. It was already with police. Triggering a factory reset required a fresh decision to test whether the phone remained connected, and if it did, to erase it. Patterson described the decision as stupid. Prosecutors described it as deliberate interference with evidence. Jurors were required to be careful. People lie for many reasons: shame, fear, privacy, or a desire to avoid suspicion. A lie becomes evidence of guilt only when the jury is satisfied it was told because the truth would reveal involvement in the offense. The judge's directions mattered because the case contained many lies, but none could substitute for proof of intentional poisoning. Some criminal cases turn on a single discovery. This one accumulated through details that appeared separately, then became more troubling when placed together. One of those details was a Sunbeam food dehydrator. Patterson had purchased the appliance on the 28th of April, 2023 for $229. A dehydrator can preserve mushrooms by removing moisture. It does not neutralize death cap toxins. When questioned, Patterson initially denied owning a dehydrator.
I just want to go through on tape some of the stuff we've, and like I said, we'll give you a copy of this, everything we've seized. Kitchen, far left bottom drawer, instruction manual for a Sunbeam Food Lab electronic dehydrator. What's that in relation to? Do you know anything about a dehydrator in your house? Or?
That denial was false. CCTV from the Coonawarra transfer station showed her disposing of the appliance after the lunch. Police recovered it from the tip on August 4th, the same day Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson died. At trial, Patterson admitted lying about it and dumping it. She said she panicked because Simon Patterson had asked whether she had poisoned his parents using mushrooms prepared in her dehydrator. Panic can explain irrational behaviour. It can also reveal consciousness of guilt. The jury had to decide which interpretation fit the whole of the evidence. The dehydrator was not an isolated object. Friends provided police with messages and photographs showing Patterson discussing mushrooms, including images of mushrooms placed on dehydrator trays. She had written about blitzing mushrooms so she could hide them in food for her children. Again, none of that alone proved murder. Many people dehydrate mushrooms. Many parents conceal disliked ingredients in meals, but the messages established familiarity with processing mushrooms into a form that could disappear inside food. Then there were the phones and devices. During the August 2023 search of her home, police seized electronic devices. The court heard that one phone had been factory reset 3 times. A reset was performed on the day police searched the house. Another was triggered remotely after the device had been taken to a police station. Patterson admitted doing it. She told the court she feared police would find photographs of mushrooms and the dehydrator. That explanation required the jury to accept that an innocent woman, already at the centre of a fatal poisoning investigation, tried to erase material from a phone in police custody because she was frightened of how innocent mushroom photographs might look. The prosecution argued the resets were part of a broader effort to destroy or conceal evidence. There were also changing accounts of what she had eaten, what the children had eaten, where mushrooms had been purchased, and what had happened to the appliance used to dry them. Patterson said the day after the lunch she scraped mushroom and pastry from leftover Wellingtons before serving the beef to her children. Prosecutors said that account was false. If the children had eaten uncontaminated leftover beef while the mushroom layer was discarded, it could support the claim that she had acted protectively. The prosecution argued the supposed leftovers given to the children never existed in the way she described. A lie does not automatically prove murder, but repeated lies about objects, food, and digital evidence connected directly to 3 deaths can become part of a circumstantial case, particularly when the accused is the only person who prepared and served the meal. The iNaturalist evidence gave the prosecution a possible route from the landscape to the kitchen. The platform is public. A person does not need specialist contacts to learn where a dangerous species has recently been observed. A map, a date, and a photograph can turn rare botanical knowledge into accessible information. That did not prove Patterson viewed a particular report or collected a particular mushroom. The defence emphasised the gaps. Tower coverage was broad. Travel in regional Victoria can place a phone near many innocent destinations. Public sightings do not identify the person who later removed a specimen, but circumstantial cases gain force through convergence. A suspected death cap photographed on scales becomes more significant when the accused owned a dehydrator, had discussed processing mushrooms, travelled in areas where death caps were reported, prepared a mushroom-based meal, and later tried to erase devices and discard equipment. The scales themselves carried an unsettling implication. Weighing can be an ordinary part of cooking or foraging. It can also be a way to control dosage. The prosecutor put the darkest interpretation directly to Patterson, that she had calculated how much was required to kill. Patterson rejected it, and no document recording such a calculation was produced. This distinction is central to responsible storytelling. The jury convicted Patterson of intentional poisoning. It did not deliver a separate factual finding that every prosecutorial suggestion about collection, weighing, or planning occurred exactly as alleged. the documentary can explain the theory without transforming every suggestion into established fact. The investigation had to solve a practical problem. Death cap mushrooms do not materialize in a kitchen by themselves. If Patterson had deliberately poisoned the meal, she needed access to them. Investigators examined public sightings uploaded to iNaturalist, a citizen science platform where users record plants, animals, and fungi. Death cap sightings had been reported in the Gippsland region, including around Loch and Outram in the months before the lunch. The prosecution used phone and cell tower evidence to argue that Patterson had travelled to areas associated with those sightings. The defence challenged the precision and significance of that evidence. The jury had to consider what the data could prove and what it could not. More direct were photographs recovered from Patterson's tablet. They showed mushrooms sitting on a set of scales. Fungi expert Dr. Tom May identified the mushrooms with a high level of confidence as death caps. During cross-examination, prosecutor Nanette Rogers, senior counsel, suggested Patterson was weighing the mushrooms to calculate fatal doses, including enough for multiple people. Patterson denied it. There was no video of her placing poison into the Wellingtons. No eyewitness saw her collect death caps and carry them into the kitchen. No message said, plainly, that she intended to kill her relatives. The prosecution case was circumstantial. That word is sometimes misunderstood. Circumstantial does not mean weak. It means the conclusion is drawn from a combination of facts rather than a direct observation of the crime itself. Imagine entering a room and seeing wet footprints leading from the door, an open umbrella dripping on the floor, and a coat covered in rain. You did not see the person walk through a storm, but the circumstances may prove it beyond any reasonable alternative. Here, the circumstances included access to wild mushrooms, knowledge of dehydrating them, images of suspected death caps on scales, a meal designed in individual parcels, a different plate used by the host, 4 guests poisoned while the host survived, a discarded dehydrator, false denials, unverifiable claims about an Asian grocery, factory resets, leftovers containing beta-amanitin, and conduct prosecutors said showed an effort to present herself as another victim. The defense asked the jury to see a terrible accident, followed by panic, confusion, and foolish lies. The prosecution asked them to see preparation, execution, and concealment. Between those two stories stood the only surviving guest. Ian Wilkinson described the table, the food, and the plate from which Erin ate. His evidence placed the jury inside the room where the poisoning occurred. He also represented something no forensic exhibit could fully capture: the human cost of surviving when his wife, his sister-in-law, and his brother-in-law did not. The public fascination surrounding the trial created another challenge. Jurors were not deciding a mystery in private. The case had already attracted international headlines, documentary crews, podcasts, and daily reporting. Justice Beale repeatedly emphasised that their task was confined to admissible evidence heard in court. The distinction between admissible and inadmissible material became important. The jury did not hear every allegation that had circulated publicly, and it did not decide every charge originally laid. Responsible coverage must preserve those boundaries rather than use information excluded from the trial to make the verdict appear inevitable. The defence attempted to introduce photographs and videos said to demonstrate Patterson's history of mushroom foraging. The judge ruled that material inadmissible. Her appeal later argued that exclusion contributed to a miscarriage of justice. At trial, however, the jury made its decision on the evidence it was permitted to consider. Closing addresses gave the two sides their final opportunity to organise months of testimony into competing narratives. The prosecution argued the coincidences were too numerous and too directed to be innocent. The defence argued that once an accidental poisoning occurred, every fearful decision Patterson made was being reinterpreted through the assumption that she was a murderer. The jury did not have to decide whether Patterson was likeable, truthful in every aspect of her life, or morally responsible for every family conflict. It had to decide whether the prosecution had proved beyond reasonable doubt that she intentionally poisoned each guest and meant to kill them. After nearly 10 weeks of evidence and more than 50 witnesses, the case narrowed to that question. The volume of material was enormous, but the legal test remained simple to state and difficult to apply. Was there any reasonable possibility of accident? The 4 verdicts showed the jury's answer was no. Erin Patterson was arrested in November 2023 and charged with 3 murders and 5 attempted murders. Before the trial, several alleged attempted murder charges involving Simon Patterson were separated from the lunch case and were not ultimately part of the jury's task in the 2025 trial. They must not be used to assume guilt in the offences the jury did consider. The trial began in April 2025 at the Latrobe Valley Law Courts in Morwell. The prosecution did not claim to possess a confession or a proven motive. Instead, it built a sequence. Patterson had access to death caps. She possessed equipment and knowledge capable of drying and concealing mushrooms in food. She invited the intended diners and prepared individual Wellingtons. The guests were poisoned, while she survived. Afterwards, she lied about the dehydrator, disposed of it, gave an unverifiable account of mushroom purchases and reset electronic devices. The defence accepted that the lunch contained death cap mushrooms. It accepted that Patterson had lied about significant matters. But it argued the poisoning was accidental, and the lies were the panicked behaviour of a woman who realised she would be blamed for a catastrophe. Then Patterson entered the witness box. For days, the prosecutor tested her explanations line by line. Why had she lied about the dehydrator? Why had she discarded it? Why were mushrooms photographed on scales? Why was her meal served differently? Why did she leave hospital? Why did she reset a phone that police had already seized? Patterson denied deliberately poisoning anyone. She maintained that the death caps entered the meal accidentally, possibly through mushrooms she had foraged and stored without recognizing the danger. Her decision to testify gave the jury an opportunity unusual in many murder trials. They did not only hear lawyers describe her account, they watched her give it, defend it, and change emphasis under sustained cross-examination. The jury also heard expert evidence about fungi, toxins, pathology, phone data, and the food remnants. They examined photographs of the kitchen, plates, mushrooms, the dehydrator, and the leftovers. The judge directed them that suspicion was not enough. Public attention was not evidence. Patterson's lies could not simply be treated as an automatic confession. The prosecution had to exclude any reasonable possibility that the poisoning was accidental. After the evidence and closing addresses ended, the jurors withdrew. They deliberated for days. On the 7th of July, 2025, they returned to court.
For the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson, I sentence you to 25 years imprisonment. For the murder of Heather Wilkinson, I sentence you to life imprisonment. For the murder of Gail Patterson, I sentence you to life imprisonment. For the murder of Don Patterson, I sentence you to life imprisonment. All sentences are to be served concurrently.
The jury had rejected the accident story. They had concluded that the poison was placed into the meals deliberately and that Erin Patterson intended the consequences. The case that had begun with an ordinary invitation had ended with 4 guilty verdicts. The guilty verdicts also changed the meaning of earlier moments. The invitation was no longer merely the beginning of an unexplained tragedy. The separate plates were no longer a curious memory. The discarded appliance was no longer simply an object thrown away in panic. In the legal account accepted by the jury, they became parts of a deliberate act. For relatives, that legal certainty may coexist with emotional disbelief. Murder within a family forces survivors to hold incompatible memories together. Ordinary conversations, shared celebrations, and acts of kindness beside the knowledge of what the offender later did. A verdict cannot make those memories align neatly. Ian Wilkinson's survival ensured that the story was not told only through police exhibits and expert reports. He was able to describe the lunch, endure cross-examination, and represent the 3 people who could not enter the witness box. His presence prevented the victims from disappearing entirely behind the forensic complexity of amatoxins and phone data. There is also a broader reason the case unsettled so many people. Food is one of the oldest gestures of care. We cook for family, bring meals to the sick, and gather around tables to resolve conflict. Poisoning reverses that meaning. The act of nourishment becomes the method of harm, while the victim participates willingly because eating together is supposed to be safe. That inversion is why the case remains difficult to forget. The weapon was hidden not only inside pastry and mushroom paste, but inside a social ritual. The victims did not need to be overpowered. They only needed to believe that lunch was lunch. A verdict resolves the legal question put to a jury. It does not restore the people who were lost. Don and Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson died because they accepted a meal prepared by someone within their family circle. Ian Wilkinson survived, but survival carried its own weight. He endured prolonged treatment, the death of his wife, and the knowledge that he had shared the same table, the same food, and almost the same fate.
We're thankful that when things go wrong, there are good people and services and systems available to help us recover. I'd like to encourage all those involved to keep turning up and serving others. Our lives and the life of our community depends on the kindness of others. I'd like to encourage everybody to be kind to each other.
The case became international news. Reporters travelled to Morwell. Spectators queued for courtroom seats. The phrase mushroom murders turned a family catastrophe into a headline that could be repeated in a few seconds. But the shorthand risks distorting what happened. The mushrooms were the weapon. The crime worked because of trust. No stranger forced entry into a home. No attack began in a dark street. 4 relatives were invited inside, seated at a table and served food by a person they had every social reason to trust. On the 8th of September, 2025, Justice Christopher Beale sentenced Erin Patterson to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 33 years. The court recognised the enormity of 3 murders and 1 attempted murder. Patterson had already spent long periods in isolation, and the sentencing judge considered the conditions she was likely to experience in prison. That consideration would later become part of the prosecution's challenge to the sentence. At sentencing, the language of years and non-parole periods attempted to place a legal measurement around harm that could not truly be measured. 3 lives ended. 1 survivor carried injuries and grief forward. Children and relatives were left to reconcile the person they knew with the person a jury found had planned and carried out the poisoning. Communities in Korumburra and across South Gippsland mourned people remembered for faith, service, and quiet decency, not for the grotesque label that came to define the case publicly. And still, one question remained largely unanswered. Why? The jury did not need a proven motive. The evidence did not reveal one simple explanation capable of making the crime emotionally comprehensible. Family tension may provide context. Resentment may provide a theory. Control, anger, or fear may be suggested by conduct, but none should be presented as a solved equation. Sometimes a criminal trial establishes what happened and who was responsible, while leaving the inner reason inaccessible. That absence can be more disturbing than a neat motive, because it leaves the lunch looking almost exactly as it first appeared, ordinary from the outside, lethal beneath the surface. Erin Patterson remains convicted and is serving a life sentence with a 33-year non-parole period. She has lodged an appeal challenging her convictions. Her grounds include allegations that the prosecution's cross-examination and closing address caused a miscarriage of justice, criticism of aspects of the evidence, a complaint about excluded mushroom foraging material, and an issue arising from arrangements involving the sequestered jury. The Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions is also appealing the sentence, arguing that it was inadequate. Both matters are scheduled to be heard on the 19th and 20th of August 2026. Those proceedings may affect the legal ending. They do not change the central event examined in this episode. 4 people were poisoned at a family lunch. 3 died, 1 survived, and a jury concluded the host had done it deliberately. The final legal word may still be ahead, but in a diary once kept by Gail Patterson, the beginning remained only a small handwritten note. Lunch at Erin's. Until next time, keep the lights on, because Australia feels very different after dark.